Želimo da vam predstavimo našeg sljedećeg govornika, to je Diego Marin. On je iz Evropskog biroa za životnu sredinu. On se bavi temom međunarodnog razvoja s tim što je specijalizirao političku, strategiju i komunikaciju. U svojoj akademskoj karijeri se najviše bavio pitanjima ekološkog prava, prava domorodačkih naroda i suzbijanja siromaštva. A svoju tezu, magistarsku, je pisao u Peru, utvrđujući vezu između ekstraktivizma i siromaštva i toga kako ga zapravo ekstraktivizam proizvodi. Tako da mu želim dobrodošlicu i da mu dam reč.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. All right, so again, I don't need to introduce myself. I'm going to try to make this discussion, I have an hour. I won't use that whole hour to explain what the Critical Raw Materials Act is to you, but I would like it to at least make it engaging to some extent. I will try. I didn't prepare for the engaging part, but we'll run through it. Okay, perfect. So let's go through the first slide. Before I explain this, I just want to ask, just by a raise of hands, who here has heard about the Critical Raw Materials Act? Okay, so the minority. Okay, some people late, then maybe reconsidered. Who here knows what critical raw materials are? Okay, maybe even more people actually. Great, so it's about half the room, which is fine. I will try to not get too much into details, but still hopefully to be engaging enough. And then there will be a session, of course, of questions and answers in which you can come in and disagree with me if you like. Okay, so just to give a background on this Critical Raw Materials Act, it does not come in a vacuum. There's historical precedents that allowed for this. One of them being COVID crisis. Of course, we had a lot of supply chain issues when it comes to medical equipment, particularly PPE, so protected. I'm sorry? It's good? Yeah? Okay. And then we found out really through COVID that it really shook up the globalization dynamics. And we saw how just dependent Europe was in the United States as well, in the case of China. So China became really a starting point to really analyze, okay, how dependent are we on our supply chains? It started with medical equipment, but then it also extrapolated to other areas, car manufacturing, and that also requires massive amounts of raw materials, electronics, what have you, ICTs, what they're called. And then also tied to this, we also had the global race for critical raw materials. In general, countries are trying to move away from a fossil fuel economy. I mean, and I say that in quotation marks because I actually explain why that's complicated and not so simple to say. But there is a large demand, particularly to extract these materials for the supposed green and digital transitions. And then lastly, there is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, which increased this issue of raw material dependencies. And on the top graph, you can see a little bit, it's a bit of outdated data, but still important. It just highlights the dependency on the Russian on the country of Russia for European sources. And this is particularly true in the case of uranium, particularly true also in the case of palladium. So a lot of issues happened in which we were largely insourcing nickel, particularly from Russia, and we had to divert our nickel production, our nickel insourcing from Russia. In this case, it came to Indonesia, and also, as I'll explain later, internal or inshoring of these extractive practices. Okay, great. Before I get deeper into this concept, I want to highlight something that is really, really important. Because you need to explain a subject that is seemingly complicated, you need to explain its foundations. Why are we doing this? One of the things that countries are trying to do within this digital and green transition narrative is what is called economic decoupling. They're trying to decouple economic growth measured in GDP from environmental impacts. And if you look at it, GDP is actually a measure of energy. Most economies don't really realize that, but it is. And for the simple fact that GDP is actually a measure of economic activity within a particular area. And this economic activity needs energy. You can't do anything without energy. If your human body, for example, wants to move, it needs to consume to move, right? And this same applies for economies. And so you can't separate GDP from energy again. And in this case, this is particularly true because while energy, you can separate, I should say, a little bit because there is such a thing as energy efficiency. So energy efficiency, it uses resources better, or in the case of energy, it sources energy better for an output or an activity, right? And we have become much more efficient since, for example, the 1970s, when we wanted to become super efficient, particularly because of the oil crisis. For some of you who are old enough to remember that. I'm not, but I did study it. And we do notice that there was a talk of efficiency to make best use of oil when it was at a limited supply, right? Fast forward 50 years, our economies have become much more efficient. At the same time, they have been much more resource seeking, right? And on the right-hand side, you can see that the material footprint, which is measured in biomass, fossil fuels, metallic and non-metallic minerals, is highly correlated with global GDP. And we do see, by the way, in terms of carbon emissions, a slight, what is called relative decoupling. Yes, you can relatively decouple carbon emissions, but once you look at materials, we just see no link. And I think this is important just to highlight where this is coming from. Okay, so who here has heard about the Green Deal? Okay, I would say more people than the critical raw materials, which makes sense. Yeah, well, actually, maybe I won't have somebody explain and put you on the spot, but basically the Green Deal is to create an economy in the EU to get us to what is called net neutrality by 2050, carbon neutrality as well. This attempt is quite substantial because it's the EU's being the first region in the world that's pursuing this with such effort. And it's also important on the right-hand side on the graph, it's not just about carbon emissions. I mean, yes, that's the biggest aspect, but it's also about how soil ties to carbon, how agriculture ties to carbon. And you know, in 2019, late 2019, when this came about, there's a lot of hope. 4 years on, there's a lot of contention, of course, of what this means with the Green Deal. Particularly, some of you may have known about the farming protests in Germany and France. Of course, we as civil society organizations we basically argue that the Green Deal needs to have a just transition component within it. Otherwise, you will not be able to get the social support for it. So anyway, it's also the twin transitions are embedded within the Green Deal because it wants to digitalize the economy and decarbonize the economy. Again, a pointer from the first slide, it's not seeking to dematerialize the economy, which is a big point. In terms of this, where does the Critical Raw Materials Act lie? It's basically the EU has gathered 5 sectors with 15 important technologies for these raw materials. And in this question, I want to ask, how many people here have heard in terms of critical raw materials and the green transition? I mean, how many people have heard them basically come one in one? Okay, great. Later on, I will mention the issues with that. Or maybe I can just do that now, since I'm talking about economic growth, and it's really important. The green transition, or the critical raw materials for the green transition, are only a portion. Many of the critical raw materials, the EU has 34 critical raw materials. 17 actually, with the latest aluminum being in the strategic raw materials list. These are all the 17 raw materials that are needed for these technologies, right? Phosphate is a critical raw material, but it's not considered here. I mean, we need phosphate for food production, right? But I would like to highlight that when you hear this critical raw materials, Green Deal, and you hear the energy transition, that's only a part of it. In the case of nickel, which is a strategic raw material, 70% of nickel is used for steel manufacturing, so stainless steel. which the vast majority of that is used by the construction sector. It is not by batteries, right? You look at copper, 40% of copper is used by the construction sector. Another 30 to 40 is used by electronic equipment, cell phones, washing machines, whatever. Also the wires that are connecting the house, for example, all of that. And just now, in the recent few years, is the energy transition being added on top of this. So again, it's an addition. It is not the end-all, be-all. Critical raw materials are needed for the economy as a whole. And as you expand the economy, the more materials you need. And I want to highlight that point because it's really crucial to get an idea that this is not for the energy transition, but it's being sold to us as it is. Yes, the energy transition will need materials, 100%. But my point that I'm trying to make here is we can argue how much of materials we need once we acknowledge that every sector needs it. Because every sector is competing for these somewhat scarce resources. So, tied to this point, raw materials demand. Quite frankly, I don't worry too much about raw materials demand in the particular numbers. And the reason why I say this is because they're projections. And like every projection, you talk to anybody who predicts the future, very chances are that they're wrong. So I don't try to focus on, oh, we need 60 times more lithium by 2050, no, whatever. What my concern is the exponential rise. And you see this everywhere, you know? I'll explain later about why this is an issue, but the exponential rise is particularly true in the case of lithium. And as you can see on the bottom, on the bottom is JRC, so that's the Joint Resource Center. Joint Research Center, sorry. That is an EU body that looks into scientific facts, scientific research. And they have done, in their latest 2023 foresight study, calculated how much the EU will need. And as you can see, the LDS means low demand scenario, and HDS is high demand scenario. And those two, the only thing that differs between them is really how technological uptake, what they call technological uptake, but it's really how fast technology is going to move here. So, you know, in the low demand scenario, it moves slower. High demand scenario, it moves faster. And then on the left-hand side, on the bottom, that's the IEA. I mean, it's basically many different scenarios. So the numbers differ. For lithium, there is 13 times to 42 times. So this is why I don't worry so much about it. But I do worry about the exponential rise, right? By the way, this is just for the energy transition. As far as I know, they haven't calculated how much the EU economy will need of copper for its construction plans by 2050 and how that differs from this. You see what I'm saying? Once we actually look at the whole issue, this is an underestimation of what the economy in projection to 2050 is looking to get as far as materials go. And I mean to tell you this is really important because it just highlights the absurdity of it all. Right now, we have 6 planetary boundaries that have been crossed. Last year, we just have this research. If you know planetary boundaries, just to really put it simply, is a means to measure how our consumption and production in humans, how we are impacting the environment, and staying within these planetary limits allows us to have an economy, a society that is able to survive. And I really mean this sincerely. It's really about survival. So in this sense, we have crossed 6 of the 9. Research is undergoing right now of the other 3. But in 2023, we have crossed 6 of the 9, and we're expecting, in general, by the IRP, which is the International Resource Panel, they're expecting that global consumption of materials will expand 60% by 2060. It's massive. So this is what I'm saying. When we look at these materials, that is just one sector, well, or I guess I should say 5 sectors, right? Is not looking at the other sectors of the economy that are also going to be competing for these materials. So unless we don't get creative, we're going to, 1, not even achieve this, and 2, sacrifice communities and keep crossing these planetary boundaries further on. Right now, the latest pursuit, I would say, is the deep sea. Now companies are trying to mine the ocean because the materials that are found on land really are largely, to some extent, the best materials, so the better ores, have been already extracted. Now we have to dig deeper which requires much more technology and is much more expensive. Or you have to go to biodiversity-rich areas like the Amazon or Greenland, for example. What this does is it creates real pressures on looking for new areas, and this particularly the deep sea. Some companies are actually even attempting to potentially, and I don't think they'll ever be able to achieve this, but mine asteroids or potentially mine the moon. So that's what I'm saying. This idea of economic growth, and I think it was mentioned in our last panel, is so pervasive that it's so irrational at the same time. And how is this created? Well, in a sense, it's like to convince people of irrationality, you have to win their minds and hearts. People are largely, I mean, I think people are very rational, just in general, and that's what makes us human. That's okay. But you have to convince people of something. And what is done through this is usually through the use of science, numbers, research, what have you, that have a bias. Everybody has a bias, of course. In models, you talk to any model, if there's any model is here, put shit in, you get shit out, you know? Every model has a bias, right? But some models are useful. But still, it's really important to look at how this pervasive nature unfolds. And in this sense, a colleague, Martin Layana and Adrian Almazan, so this is not my research, but they really put it into figures as to how this idea of these scenarios, these demand scenarios are calculated, right? We have the assumptions on the left, what those assumptions are trying to do, and then you have the international reports, and these reports become policy. And this policy has real impact on people and planet. And I think that's really important because, as the next slide shows, these reports are the major reports that are being used by governments to excuse their extraction and the need for demand. The World Bank Group, which I believe it was 2020, which predicted that critical raw materials will be needing to expand to 500% to meet climate targets. Again, the IEA even complicates that a little bit more because they use a more relevant and more rigorous methodology. And then lastly, KU Leuven, which released this report, I believe 2 years ago, translated the IEA data, but into Europe. And all of these, because I've talked to some of the modelers here as well, all of these scenarios do not look at what is called sufficiency. They don't look on alternative economic models. What they do is they predict annual growth rate for the economy, about a 3%, 2 to 3% annual growth rate. And what this does is it means basically that your economy, and again, I mentioned economy, energy are tied, GDP are tied, materials, energy, and GDP are all tied. Once you grow your economy by 3%, or you're expecting it to grow by 3%, you're effectively doubling your economy in about 25 years, more or less. So imagine, all of the materials that we have now, we've created our society to seek to expand that material double by 2050. I mean, it's really insane. How many products do we have at home that are just lying around? Imagine double that, right? So in a sense, and all of these products need materials. Again, just not to go into detail, because I would like to talk about the Critical Raw Materials Act, I think it's really important. But one of the things that what this really seeks to is primarily is a doubling of global fleet of vehicles. So is an energy transition that is highly dependent on electric vehicles. And electric vehicles, 60% of the demand, this is calculated by the KU Leuven on the right-hand side, 60% of the demand for critical raw materials, or I guess you could say strategic raw materials to be more accurate, is coming from the mobility sector alone. So in the mobility sector, I'm not talking about mass public transport where you have a lot of cities, really trying to get away from buses, or mass public trains, which, as a societal endeavor, we would say, yes, that's fair enough, But no, it's what it's arguing is for private vehicle use and building cities based on private vehicle use, which drives the demand for these materials, right? And again, these are models, presumptions, assumptions, what have you, on what the future is going to look like. And we don't have, as far as I know, well, I will show some other ones, there's no official models that actually try to calculate what is called demand reduction, which is possible. Because we have some researchers that have done it. So in this case, we look at the locomotion project, which is a horizon project that the EB was a part of. This is just kind of like different chemistries and the limits of substitution. I won't go necessarily too into detail. I put that out there so you can read it, but it does highlight different demand scenarios for copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and it creates an EV high, so meaning a transition that is highly dependent upon electric vehicles. It does one where it's more moderated on, for example, electric bikes as an idea, and one that is called the degrowth, which is the reduction of demand. And in this reduction of demand, for most, I would say, we have no major issues with supply chain concerns, mainly because you have reduced your economy to the point that you need less. You're less dependent on external supply chains, and you're less dependent on primary extraction. Again, the recycling aspect, a lot of people will tell you, yeah, well, we can't really recycle all of these material because we don't have enough material in stock. And that's a fair point. That is a fair point. But that's a fair point only because your metric is to have exponential growth of the economy. Once you downsize that because you've removed private vehicle use, or your assumptions on private vehicle use, and you put massive public transport in there, or you do, for example, what is called get rid of planned obsolescence, so that products last longer and they don't die, and then you recycle these materials, right? Or, well, anyway, more sophisticated measures. I don't have to get into details right now. But what this does is it reduces or actually it increases the capacity of recycling to meet the targets, which is really interesting, because as you reduce the demand, you increase the potential of secondary raw materials to uptake that percentage of what you're looking for. And as I explained in the Critical Raw Materials Act, this becomes very evident with the targets that the CRMA has. Okay, yeah, and then just some other scenarios that I mentioned because it's really important. This has not been done by official government bodies or institutional bodies. This has been done by researchers, universities, right? Or civil society as well. On the one that achieving zero emissions with more mobility and less mining, they find that under its most ambitious scenario, you can reduce mining for lithium by about 90%, massive. On the clever scenario, they don't particularly, on the clever scenario, the purple one, they don't particularly model materials, but they do model energy. And what they find is that by 2040, we can reach our climate targets and reduce our energy by about 40 to 50%. And like I mentioned before, you can't separate energy from materials. If you reduce your energy output, you reduce your material output. And this is really, really important because these models really tell government institutions, the science is there and we're developing it. Look into it so you can actually put it in your models and have a much more accurate data of what the policies that are gonna come out. And then this is on the right-hand side, as you can see, is the modeling for the horizon locomotion project that I was telling you about. Nickel is the only one where we see that there is a big issue, even if we were to reduce the economy, and that's because nickel, in this case, is used by all 15 technologies within the Critical Raw Materials Act. Okay, so now we're getting to the big one. Maybe I should ask, is there any immediate poignant questions? I mean, we'll have some more time, but before I move now into the Critical Raw Materials Act, just to make sure you're not falling asleep on me, any questions that are really I need to ask this now before you move on? If not, then I can just move on, but just curious.
We are very focused.
Okay.
Please continue.
Sounds good. Okay, so the purpose of the Critical Raw Materials Act, like I mentioned earlier, there is a big issue with supply chain concerns, particularly pushed on by, I would say, pushed on by everybody, but the German car manufacturing industry was hugely involved in this, and because they're really, really dependent on China and other countries for their components, right, for their vehicles. So, that's just one of them. There were many other industries as well. Yeah, the idea is to strengthen the stages of the critical raw materials value chain, to improve EU capacity to monitor and mitigate risks. Basically, the EU wants to know through risk exercises done by companies, but also by member states, that where they see supply chain issues coming up, that they're able to inform each other and know ahead of time. So that way you don't get caught with a conflict, for example, in one area where it cuts off all of your sources from that area. The other one is, well, tied to this point, is to diversify EU imports. Basically, we just don't want to be dependent upon China, not even China, but also other countries on these materials. And then lastly, which is favorable to some extent, there's still work to do, but to improve critical raw material circularity and sustainability, which means increase the circular economy, so basically use the best out of what you have, though at the point they're focusing on the lower stages of the waste hierarchy, and I don't necessarily have to explain the waste hierarchy, but it focuses highly on recycling rather than product design, so that which is even more important from a circularity perspective. And it does focus on sustainability, meaning that it's trying to clean up the mining practices. Again, this is in paper. Implementation is a whole different thing. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that where most of the critical raw materials come from for the EU. In the case of Russia, you see palladium, 40%. China, look at the list of China. I mean, it's massive, right? And just a caveat, this is the thing that I always say, we will not be able to separate from China. This de-risking, decoupling language, we're just not going to. One, because China, and I'll just say this, because a lot of people have interest in China. China right now produces 30% of value-added manufacturing around the world. It's the highest country. It's double the EU and US. It's massive. They have done this strategy on raw materials since 2003. In 2003, they were really trying to develop their photovoltaics manufacturing, the supply chain for that, because they saw a trend long-term that this is where the world's going to be heading to in the future, and we need to already build. In 2015, they released this strategy, basically Build in China 2025, I can't remember the exact name, where, imagine, is a Critical Raw Materials Act, an Inflation Reduction Act, but 10 years prior. So China's already way ahead of this. Not only are they way ahead of this, they don't have the single market rules that we have here, in which a state cannot subsidize really its own companies to well, benefit society, I guess, or whatever have you. In China, the state is a leading role into this. And this is why the market there is able to mobilize much quicker. And actually, in China, people say that it's not competitive, it's extremely dumbed down. China is an extremely competitive environment for companies there. And only the top actually rise. And what happens is, when there's extreme competition on the ground, once those companies rise up and become a leader in China, the world really cannot compete because we just let the free market do everything. And free market allocates, well, where it wants. There is no guidance and direction, right? So this is, and just simplifying, I mean, it's a lot more to it. But I'm simplifying the issue of geopolitical tensions and why the EU sees itself as being potentially a rival to Russia. But this is more of a personal view. My NGO is not necessarily involved in geopolitical tensions analyzing China versus the EU market. But from my own research, and also the research of others, the state capacity to mobilize the market is not there at the EU like it is in China. And this is why we just become vulnerable, I guess, I would say, when it comes to these geopolitical tensions. The EU has much more fiscal space, what it's called, to mobilize funds, for example. So it's able to actually, in this case of the Inflation Reduction Act, is able to attract businesses to the US. And many of these businesses are actually European. So it's freaking out us a lot, particularly the German car manufacturers or even chips manufacturers potentially moving over there. So it's a big concern for the EU. Where do we lie in this geopolitical space between China and the United States, right? And also the lack of cheap resources from Russia. Because, like it or not, we used to get really cheap energy prior to 2022 from Russia in gas. And now we don't. And the gas that we do is actually liquefied gas coming from the United States, and we're paying a lot more money for it. Or Russian gas coming from India and Turkey, but we pay a lot more money for it. So it's interesting because we kind of shot ourselves in the foot. And I think we should have absolutely moved away from Russian gas a long time ago. But this delay of climate action, which should have been done 10 years ago, put us in the spot where we are now, where we're really dependent. And now we have all of these well, like the Critical Raw Materials Act and many other policies that are trying to get us to net zero or like sustainable energy really extremely quick. And that's what delay has done, right? Delay has really made us vulnerable. Anyway, so now getting into the Critical Raw Materials Act with the targets. So there is 3 targets, well, 4 I should say, 3 targets and 1 sub-target. The major target is domestic extraction at the EU level, meaning that within the EU 27, we will seek to extract 10% of our raw materials needs. This is in the aggregate, by the way, it's not individual. 40% of that will be processed within the EU. Right now, it depends on which material you're talking about, but it's much, much lower than 40%. I can't give a figure necessarily. I don't know in the aggregate, but it's much lower than that. And then recycling, this is the original one, so this came out last year, but the recycling is now at 25%. So the EU is trying to recycle a quarter of its raw material needs by 2030. And then lastly, external sources, like I mentioned earlier, supply chain dependencies. It wants to maximize only 65% of one material should come from one country. And in this case of rare earths, for example, around 90% is coming from China. So it wants to really reduce that. And I can talk about what some of the hotspots in Europe are for rare earths. And anyway, so on the bottom, yeah, like I mentioned, aluminum joined the list of strategic raw materials. So that's a subset of critical raw materials, those needed for the 15 technologies that I mentioned earlier. And this was highly pushed by the aluminum industry in Europe, which saw itself basically saying to the Commission, look, the energy prices right now, and really the cheap energy that we would get from Russia, is no longer there. We're paying too much, and we're having to shut down some of our aluminum processing plants. So they basically begged the Commission, add us into this list, because if you don't, the aluminum industry is at risk in Europe. And of course, they did the traditional loss of jobs and stuff like that, which they have a point. But I just want to say, yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff here on the left-hand side. But this idea of imports, yeah, it's they're going to create a critical raw materials board. Basically, this means that every member state is going to have one person that goes into this raw materials board, and it's going to be organized by the Commission. And the Commission and them are going to talk about, okay, what does the EU market look like? How is it affecting your industries in your country? But they're also going to talk about what is called strategic projects. And this is the bread and butter of the Critical Raw Materials Act is strategic projects. And I'll mention maybe here in the next one. Up. Ah, yeah, voilà. So strategic projects. Basically, the biggest argument was that it came from mining, really, because technically there's strategic projects for processing and recycling, but the main point was mining. The industry has been fighting against this for a very long time. They basically said that there is too much red tape across the EU level. It takes around 15 to 20 years to carry a mine through. If you want these targets for the energy transition, we're going to have to make mine quicker. Cut it by a third. Or a half at least. And what this means is that this lobbying for the mining companies, they said, we have too many regulations in the EU, they're making it difficult to mine in the EU, et cetera, so we need to cut it down. But when you look at jurisdictions like the United States, Australia, in African countries or Latin American countries, it's generally between 10 to 20 years that it takes to carry on a mine, not only because of red tape or environmental regulations, but also because of community resistance. I mean, that is also a big project. Or the biggest one, which I know our colleagues at Earthworks did, which they will speak later, they found that companies are just actively shooting themselves in the foot by giving wrongful documents, which slows down the process, right? So it's also the companies that slow themselves down because they want to get away with not inputting enough information in what is called an environmental impact assessment, for example. And then this environmental impact assessment gets challenged by the communities or the local organizations because they're saying, look, in your impact assessment, you missed this, this, and this. The water bar is going to be impacted like this. We have for example, endangered species that you do not have in your environmental impact assessment, things like that, right? So it's complicated. But what the EU wants to do is they wanted to reduce that by around extraction of 27 months, maximum 27 months. and maximum of 15 months for processing and recycling. Now this doesn't mean, I don't want to scare you, this doesn't mean that there will be a mining project in a little bit like more than 2 years, no. But there's still a lot of processes within an environmental permit for a mine. But it does condense it, and it facilitates the communication as well, because what they're going to do is create a one-stop shop in which one agency, this differs between countries, but the idea is that one agency will be in charge of these documents, so that way documents are not just sitting there waiting to be processed. They want one organization to look over it, and they want to digitalize it, so that way you make it faster. Response, they actually have measures on how fast the company needs to inform the state and how fast the state has time to inform the company on a decision or not. So they've thought about it very, very thoroughly. And it's expected, I mean, it depends. I ask people this, they give me different ideas, but from what I'm gathering is that this would cut time to about 1/3 or 1/2 of mining project timing. So instead of a project taking 15 years or 20 years, it might take 5 or 8 years to come about on board. And then there is a selection criteria I want to say on the left. For each strategic project, there has to be a supply security, so they have to meet the targets that I mentioned earlier. There is a sustainability measure, which I'll explain in the next slide. Technical feasibility, so it's just like, it's not just any project that you can tell me that you want to have it as a strategic, but it has to be technically feasible to be done. And then there is a cross-border benefit as well, like, okay, to make sure that not only one state is benefiting, but multiple states. And then there's economic and social impacts as well. This is just some text that I wanted to highlight, but on the Article 6, application to recognition, this is for strategic projects. The language has changed a lot from what we had in the last year, through a lot of lobbying as well from civil society organizations. But the original text, I think it says measures to facilitate community consent. For those that are working on mining projects, this is huge red flag. Now they have the word of meaningful involvement, which of course is still tenuous, but it's not facilitate community consent, because facilitating community consent could also mean surveillance, could mean counter-terrorist tactics that I have seen when I have gone to Peru. We've learned about, well, I haven't seen myself, thankfully, but I have heard from people that were surveilled massively, and some people here probably have even better examples to give. But that was our biggest concern. How is the state going to be involved in this? Because I didn't mention earlier, because one of the things about strategic projects is that they will become imperative for the state to carry them through. Once they receive the strategic project status, the project is very, very likely to go through, extremely likely, because there will be state pressure to carry it through. And this is my biggest concern, because I'm wondering what that means for the local communities and the military or the police force, right? So when I hear strategic projects and I hear facilitate community consent, that's a major red flag. But anyway, so at least we have meaningful involvement. There's other measures that we have that have softened that kind of concern, but still, all in all, it is marginally improved. I will talk maybe a little bit about the raw materials diplomacy, but being in Serbia, this is not I mean, it is relevant here, of course, but if we were in Africa or Latin America or Asia, I think this point would be much more important, because as you know, of course, many of you know, Serbia is sending to the EU, and there is transposition of its laws that it needs to do. But in this case, Serbia will be joining, well, we don't know, but it's very likely. They have been invited to join the Raw Materials Club. Basically, the Raw Materials Club is the EU's attempt to, in a sense, challenge China for their BRI, so Belt and Road Initiative. It's seeking to use the global gateway, which is mobilizing 300 billion of public and private funds by 2030. Most of the money is not there, by the way, and this is something that the EU does a lot. It tells that it's going to get money, and it hopes to meet it by convincing private organizations to get that money there through incentives, but it doesn't have that money. In comparison, just to give you an idea of what we're facing, 300 billion versus 1 trillion has been mobilized already by the Belt and Road initiatives since 2015. So, you know, we're fighting with peanuts when it comes to actually being a relevant geopolitical power. But anyway, they have some measures, so knowledge sharing, crisis preparedness. So like I mentioned earlier, these countries want to collaborate with each other so that they are able to warn of supply chain concerns. The other one is boosting sustainable production and local processing. This is the interesting point because I want to, for those that are interested in international affairs or working maybe on countries in the Global South, one of their biggest critiques here is that countries in the Global South are giving the resources away to the West, primarily the West, but also China, in their raw, low added value form. I mean, mining of copper in its raw form, it's extremely low value added. And the impact that you have, which is not measured in monetary terms, but it is an impact, is much greater than the actual benefit you can get from low value added. It's a little bit different for processing, and for finished goods is absolutely different. That is where the key is. If your country is able to produce an electric vehicle, you're creating thousands of jobs. If your country is relying on mining, sorry, I mean, mining usually in a local area generally employs about 1% of the population. So it's extremely low. But if you do want it to move to a higher value added supply chain, it requires a different involvement. But anyway, so in this case, what the EU is trying to do is saying, look, I hear you, Global South countries. We have been doing this colonial thing for a long time. We want to do, oh, there is my 40-minute time stop, so I got to move quickly. What they want to do is create win-win partnerships, is what they're saying. This is what they're calling them, right? To incentivize Global South countries in being involved. But anyway, I do have to move quick, so, and I think we're behind time anyway. But the other things that I want to just mention, because I do want to leave time as well for discussion. Yeah, okay, what is green extractivism? I think that was already mentioned. We did this report in Europe looking at Portugal, Sweden, Finland, as well as Bolivia. And we looked at this concept of green extractivism. And one of the things that we noticed, particularly in the case of Sweden, was really all over Europe. The mining industry is situating itself with the climate transition so much so that now it's no longer the climate transition that they're trying to get the narrative, to win the narrative of, but now biodiversity. The mining industry knows and understands that biodiversity, forest loss, and water impacts are one of their biggest sustainability challenges. And what they're doing is now something that is called mining with nature in Sweden. If you told me this like a long time ago, I would say, wow, what the hell? But now I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, I can see why they would be moving. One, because legislation is moving that way, and they just come right behind. When I asked the mining industry there, they told me, no, we're just doing it out of basically our goodwill. But no, it's the legislation that's pushing the industries to head that way, which, fair enough, they have to adapt. But the issue is the methodology. What does mining with nature mean? And is it actually a net biodiversity impact, or are you doing some mental math to assume that it is, right? And yeah, we can talk a bit later about it, because I did go to Sweden and learn about this. We did some research in Sweden with the Sami communities there. Just to give you an idea, they're the last, and I say the last because we used to have indigenous people in Europe, but we basically don't anymore. But the Sami communities are one of the last indigenous peoples in Europe. You know, 3/4 of the mining projects are within their land, and they're facing severe issues. I won't go into detail because I do want to recommend you to read it, this report, Sacrifice Zones for Sustainability. Okay, sorry, up, one more. Okay, so I went to Sweden, and on the right-hand side is this project. I took those two photos. On the right-hand side is this mushroom that we found in this area that's supposed to be done for a graphite mine. So in this area is in Vitangi, is the north of Sweden. These rivers are pristine. They have never faced industrial impacts. And what has happened here is that the mining company has done their environmental impact assessment. And what we found when I went with for example, yeah, thanks. From a meta environmental impact assessment, if you will, the researcher there found that there was around 5 times more biodiversity, so natural values, in that region that was going to be mined than the company had reported. And 20 minutes into this natural value exercise, he found this, I don't know the name, sorry, but he found this endangered or closely, or I think he mentioned threatened actually, mushroom there. So it's interesting that in 20 minutes he was like, okay, this is threatened and this is not in the environmental impact assessment. And then on the left-hand side, you see that's an oil spill. And this happened in the Kiruna mine, which is supposedly one of the greener companies. And what this was around 1.3 million liters of oil that was spilled. And we found this actually just driving by, not even looking for it. And when I was told that this was, so it is in an area that there's nobody really living there, as we were passing by, and I had actually discussed this with the company told me, well, no, the spill had actually happened only within the industrial zone of the mine. But we were about 10 kilometers away from the mine when we found this. So it's interesting that these impacts of mines, even in countries which supposedly have extremely good laws, are happening in ways that if you're not there, you don't know it's happening, right? It's the never-ending kind of question, right? If a tree falls in the forest, did it make a sound? And then this is also related to Finland. We also did research in Finland with some researchers there. And just really quickly, what I'll say that in Finland has really pristine waters as well. They're very shallow, so very susceptible to pollution. And what happens there in Finland is that a lot of the mining companies there have basically the mining waste, right, has to have a lining that separates the mining waste from the ground, so to avoid, for example, contamination and leakage and stuff like that. Well, the mining companies, this mining waste is supposed to last, honestly, forever. Thousands of years, and our colleague Jan will explain more about this. But in the case of Finland, we have found that a lot of the mining projects there, and there hasn't been a thorough map of all of them, but many mining projects have around 10 to 100 times lower thickness of their lining than is recommended under best standard practices, which is a big issue because in terms of landfill mining, so basically, imagine landfills out there, they have even more rigorous lining to protect the earth from the trash, let's say. So in this case, we're building mines that our children, right, will have to deal with the cleanup. And we're making them only to last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So in 2100, when none of us are alive here, people will be dealing with this mess up. And I think in this case, as you can see, this is how one of the mining upstreams can impact the rivers in dark, in purple, right? And anyway, just to say, almost done here, but this is also some really, really good research from Spain that has been done on mapping, for example, the mining activities in the country of Spain. I highly suggest others to look into this as well for their own relevant countries because it's a great source of knowledge. So you want to shout them out. And I did go to Spain as well, to the southern Spain, looking at a copper mine there, where we see on the left-hand side acid mine drainage, and supposedly mining better in Europe. But we still have environmental impacts, which are similar to the ones that I saw in Cajamarca when I spent some time there looking into how mining was impacting the local communities. And that's it. So please, time for questions. Ask me whatever, challenge me, disagree. Thanks.
Na srpskom. Ne znam da li me čujete me, sorry. Već imamo ovdje jedno pitanje, imamo par ruka ovamo, doći ćemo do svih. Hoću samo da naglasim da je zapravo termin završen, trebalo bi da uđemo u vrijeme ručka. Ako vam je svima ok, da ispratimo još ova pitanja, pošto je ovo veoma zanimljiva tema i Diego nam je bio veoma inspirativan i želimo da čujemo sva pitanja. Tako da počet ću sa Žaklinom, ako u jednom trenutku ćemo uzeti više pitanja jedanput, da možemo da nekako da isklopimo, da Diego može da odgovori brže. Žaklin, izvoli.
Hvala Diego, zaista stvarno puno informacija. Poslaćeš nam, nadamo se...
Sorry, it's not working. Evo da.
Da me razumete?
Okay, maybe go?
Yeah. Do you hear the translation?
Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Okay. Hvala, zaista puno informacija. Nadamo se da ćeš nam poslati ovu prezentaciju da je detaljno izučimo. Čini mi se da Evropska unija počinje malo da prepisuje od Srbije na loš način. Mi u oblasti građevine imamo već neko vrijeme nešto što se zove objedinjena procedura, gdje se na jedan brži način izdaju građevinske dozvole za projekte, što je uticalo u mnogome, smanjilo nam je prozor uticaja da prikupimo informacije o životnoj sredini i dosta koči i procene uticaja na životnu sredinu i strateške procene uticaja na životnu sredinu. I žao mi je da Evropska unija ide tim putem. Pa me zanima da li ste se bavili time na koji način će ova skraćena procedura za izdavanje dozvola za rudnike uticati na te već postignute standarde kao što je direktiva o proceni uticaja na životnu sredinu i strateškoj proceni uticaja na životnu sredinu ili Arhuška konvencija. Da li imate možda takve neke podatke, istraživanje?
Well, yeah, on that, we don't necessarily because we haven't seen what so the Critical Raw Materials Act will be, well, it's basically done. Now they're like doing the last bits of things. We expect it to be in force maybe in April, so quite soon. And there will be a list of strategic projects that we expect it to be announced in the next few months, right? I hope that they're announced. I mean, it's possible that they just don't announce them. But the thing is, so in terms of this fast tracking, what they're trying to do, about like 1/3 of the time will be cut out, 1/3 to 1/2. In the public participation within them, we have the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, so that allows for a minimum standard on how much public participation should be required. And I think the minimum standard is about 30 days. So this strategic project can't override that. So there is a process of public participation. And the maximum that they have done, I believe, is 90 days of public participation process within the environmental impact assessment. So they have extended it a little bit, but that's the maximum, meaning that since countries are going to be able to do it within their own laws, I mean, maybe they just stick to the 30 days as minimum, right? Again, that's the tricky thing about having things on legal papers of a maximum of X. You know, chances are they're going to go for the low hold. Yeah. In this sense, it will be really much more pressure on public participation to be really organized and prepared for, and which is why alliances are so needed. Because this knowledge that we have built and that I have built in this presentation has largely come from local organizations that I visited and I went to, like particularly in Sweden or Spain, for example, or Portugal. Yeah, without that kind of collaboration, then we shoot ourselves in our own foot. But yeah, are there questions as well? Yeah.
Okay, we have 2 questions here. Imamo 2 pitanja ovde, imamo pitanje na klupi i imamo napredno pitanje. Ajde da počnemo.
Miroslav Mijatović, Pojedinski antikorupcijski tim iz Loznice. Pozdravljam vas i jako korisno predavanje. Ja sam imao priliku da budem na sedmici retkih minerala u Briselu i u Berlinu. Pitanje za vas kratko, da li znate koliko Nemačka rudari retkih minerala? Pošto sam ja pitao u Berlinu i rekli su mi 0. Sad u svetlu svetske politike da Amerika prisiljava Evropu da bude što manje zavisna od Rusije i od Kine, a da pritom trguje sa Kinom i da nema problem da trguje sa Kinom kad god je to u njenom interesu, a sa druge strane nama Nemačka kao lider Evrope servira priču da se litijum mora rudariti zbog toga da bi oni bili nezavisni od Kine, a u stvari priča je da oni treba budu ekološka država, a mi treba budemo deponija. A pritom imamo kompaniju čije vlasništvo akcija najviše China Aluminijuma. Znači, China Aluminijum je najveći vlasnik akcija Rio Tinta. I mi, dakle, imamo posla sa tom pričom, pa me interesuje jednostavno u takvom odnosu snaga vaš komentar.
Okay, there's a lot to that, and there won't be time to go through that. But on the Germany aspect, there is a really good organization called PowerShift, and they have actually analyzed the consumption of Germany. I can't remember the consumption of Germany, but in terms of the consumption of Europe, it's we produce about 3% of the global raw material production, and most of that is actually iron, coming from mainly Finland and Sweden. But we consume about 20 to 25% of the world's raw materials. And again, we make 6% of the world's population. So that means that we leave around 70 to 70% for the world to use, right? And the world is, well, China is 20% of the world's population. The US is 4% of the world's population. Massive market there. So we as Europeans are consuming these resources that are completely unjust to the rest of the world, who also wants to seek their own development pathways, right? And to your point on Serbia, and the translation is a bit hectic, which, thank you, by the way. The translators are amazing. I know it's a really hard job, but maybe I missed some things. But from what I understood in the Serbia portion, it's not like Serbia is trying to build electric vehicles here. As far as I know, there's no Serbian electric vehicle companies, right? So in this sense, the value added would still be very, very basic. I learned that there is potentially maybe one battery manufacturing in Serbia in the north, but is that, I don't know, is that already ongoing? And how much of that is going to impact the value added? So that's the thing. I'm not saying, I'm not here in this position to say Serbia should mine or should not mine. I think that's for the Serbian people to decide. But from what I'm seeing, and being from a country that produces these materials at the lowest value, sacrificing its own communities and its land from Peru, I can honestly tell you that this is a huge loss that is not calculated. Again, I mean this sincerely. There's this thing called polluter pays principle, right? But it's extremely low, and it's almost just a nice check mark to have. Polluters are not paying for the environmental damage, and the environmental damage is not counted into the GDP, right? It's only counted into the GDP if you actually fix the environmental damage. But if you leave it there, it's not counted. So again, this is what is really important, where we analyze the economy or projects based on GDP or what the impact on the economy that it can have. We are negating the huge ecological impacts that project is going to have, which is not at all looking into by politicians. Because it's difficult, and this is actually really difficult. I'm not saying that it's easy. It's difficult to calculate environmental impacts because, just how can you put a value on trees or forests or rivers? It's difficult. So I get it, but at the same time, I just want to highlight that point. There's only economic numbers that matter. So in these projects, and that's not the way it should be. So anyway, long question. Maybe we can talk about it after. But yeah. And maybe a couple more?
Ljiljana Bralović, Savez ekoloških organizacija Srbije. Ovo što ste nam ispričali, odlično bi bilo da su slušale rudarske korporacije, njima bi bilo mnogo na korist. Mi koji se branimo od rudnika, od ovoga što ste vi rekli, apsolutno nemamo nikakve koristi. Ja bih voljela da nam kažete, mislim, bar ja tako doživljavam, ne znam ostali, želela bi da mi kažete i nama svima ovde, ima li u tom paketu zakona nešto za što bi se mi koji se branimo od rudnika uhvatili i odbranili, jer mi u našoj Srbiji ne želimo ni jedan rudnik litijuma. Gospodinu ste odgovorili čisto politički, ne konkretno. Pitao vas je konkretno koliko minerala, to jest ruda, iskopava Nemačka, ako znate. Dobro, nebitno. Uglavnom, recite nam to. Da li postoji nešto u paketu zakona što bi nama bilo na korist da se odbranimo od rudnika koje ne želimo, sa svim smo svesni svih posledica, ne želimo i nećemo dozvoliti ništa da žrtvujemo u Srbiji. Dakle, ima li nešto što bi nama moglo pomoći da računamo na taj Brisel i na to u našoj odbrani? Ako ne, nama je onda sva ta priča beskorisna. Hvala.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and thank you for asking that question. In this sense, the crowd here is very diverse, so I kind of have to keep it overarching. We could, for example, the EEB is part of a 50 members organization called the Raw Materials Coalition. We're a coalition, and we work with different civil society organizations around Europe. Now, one of the things that the EEB has done is called the Right to Say No Legal Toolbox, where we have analyzed European law and put it into a language that anybody can understand and can actually use it and have it be useful to have a starting level of how to use the EU law to mobilize against or use it to protect their land, I should say. And the other thing about that is this act just came out. There is one portion on there on the sustainability criteria within the strategic projects that I highly, highly encourage civil society groups or grassroots movements to look into, because this sustainability criteria within the strategic projects list will determine or will basically tell the EU should this project go through or should it not go through based on X, X, and X. And what we could do, I think, and I'm just thinking about it based on your point, and I'll bring this back to the coalition of creating, for example, another legal toolbox to say on the Critical Raw Materials Act and working with grassroots movements to create this together. So this is something that I can take, and then maybe in the next presentation one day, we could actually tell you what you could do. But I think that's a great point, what you raised. How do we translate this political situation into what can be useful for grassroots movements? So let's exchange information, because I'm interested in developing that.
But for the non-EU countries?
For the non-EU countries, okay, fair. For the the thing is though, Serbia is ascending, so there is that link, strong link, I would say. But still, for Serbia, then we would have to work with Serbian organizations, because unfortunately, within the coalition, we have one actually. So yeah, this could be done. But again, this is something that needs to be developed. Yeah.
Okay. So we need to wrap this up. I want to see koliko pitanja ima. Podignite ruke. Imamo 3 pitanja. Krenut ćemo, ako vam je okej, produbljujemo pauzu od ručka. Ja sam za.
Ja sam htjela komentar samo. Kratak komentar. Ja sam shvatila ovo kao pomoć. Zato što zakon o kome govori Diego, bili mi članica ili ne, Evropske unije će se primjenjivati na nama. Znači, naša vlada je već potpisala da hoće pare od Evropske unije. Prošle godine u Tirani na u sklopu berlinskog procesa i usvojen je u novembru takozvani plan razvoja za Zapadni Balkan, gde obećavaju pare ovom regionu, gde su eksplicitno rekli da nas vide kao područje iz koga će da skrate te lance dostave, nearshoring na engleskom. Znači, odlučili se mi da idemo u Evropsku uniju pa moramo da primenimo, ili odlučili da ne idemo, vrlo je verovatno da će ovo o čemu vam govorio se primenjivati. Moramo da znamo kako se braniti, a da bi mogli da se branimo moramo da razumemo koja je logika, koji su argumenti koji koriste, na osnovu kojih procena pravdaju. Pogotovo što će ove iste argumente i naše vlasti da koriste, a čuli smo juče, Rio Tinto je pisao pola vas, videli smo već da plaćaju reklame u medijima sa istom ovom argumentacijom. Tako da možemo mi da kažemo nećemo to, ali taj svet je već tu. Eto, to samo htjela da kažem kao kratak komentar, ja vidim Dijega kao ogromnog saveznika i donao nam je nešto što se sada kuje. Vruće je, da čujemo o tome dok se to radi i da razmišljamo zajedno i super je predlog da, eto.
Hvala, Sonja. Video sam ovde.
Ljiljana Bralović. Čast mi je. Jelena Beronja. Ljiljana Bralović is one of, should I say it in English or Serbian? Dobro. Čast mi je što sam u istoj sobi sa vama. Upoznaćemo se, znamo se već preko društvenih mreža, ali upoznaćemo se. Htjela sam samo da kažem da sam jako, to sam već rekla kad smo imali prvu pauzu, zabrinuta, zato što sam, a možda vi znate, sad kad ste mi objasnili, znači strateški projekti Evropske unije, strategic projects, su verovatno liste potencijalnih rudnika koji će biti, da se na tom strateškom, znači da se tu pominje ili da se već našao Jadar. To je bilo oko 20. januara, otprilike. Znači da smo mi saznali ovde u Srbiji, ne znam kad se to desilo, vi možda znate, pošto ste u Briselu. Ja sam za to saznala 24. januara, samo što dnevni nisam dobila, zato što, znači, sam biolog i zato što vrlo dobro znam šta znači biološka raznovrsnost, biodiverzitet i zato što sam se borila na svoj način ovde ili onde, znači, i u programu za životnu sredinu Ujedinjenih nacija, UNEP-u. Znači, prokušala sam prošle godine da odem, znači išla sam u svoju kancelariju bivšu i razgovarala sam, rekla sam mom bivšem šefu da sam ogorčena. On je rekao, nemoj da budeš ogorčena. To nije, i to je nešto što smo malo pre pričali, nije to rešenje da se mi sada svi predamo i da budemo ogorčeni i da se borimo, mislim, pogrešnim metodama. Ovde imamo i poslanike u Srbiji, u Skupštini Srbije, s kojim možete da razgovarate takođe. I hvala vam što ste nam ovo ukazali. Znači, ono što sam ja izvukla je taj pravo da se kaže ne. Kako da koristimo EU zakon. Znači, to je nešto što možemo da pričamo, a umeđu vremenu treba da naučimo engleski i da završimo prava. Ja sam biolog, znači, treba završimo prava, izgleda da bismo mogli da se snalazimo u toj šumi svega. Eto. Pa sad, ja se izvinjavam što sam oduzela vreme od ručka.
Hvala na pitanju. Diego?
Yeah, just really quickly, just to mention that we have developed the legal right to say no toolbox. It's just at the moment in English, we lack capacity of translating it. We would love for anybody to take it and translate it within their language. If possible, it's already designed. We can see how that can be done. But the thing is, though, that this legal toolbox is a starting point. And I think it's really helpful. It's going to be really helpful if we, for example, are able to expand it and inspire other organizations to maybe do the same for their national law. What does the national law say in relation to the Critical Materials Act, and how do we condense that information and put it out of legal language and into everyday language so that people can understand, so that community movements can actually just get started somehow, because what you just mentioned about we're not lawyers, you know, we're not whatever, it's a really long and difficult process, and that, you know, when these projects are going to come up quick, JADA right now is an issue, but we don't know what other projects they're going to try to come up with, and we need to like mobilize quick, learn the law quick, and so therefore we need the tools to allow us to do that. So I think one thing that I'm going to be leaving here, at least, and this is why I think meetings like this are so helpful, is because we get out of our Brussels bubble and come here to realize what's actually happening on the ground and how we as civil societies with our privilege working in an office can actually be useful to these movements. Because these links are not strong enough yet, and I think they need to be.
Ovo postoji veoma uzburkana I dobra atmosfera. Ima dosta pitanja. Imamo pozadi jedno pitanje koje je čekalo, imamo napred još jedno I imamo treće pitanje. Voleo bih da damo vremena svima I da... Ljiljana, izvini. Možemo nastavimo debatu tokom ručka, ali ono što ću kažem jeste da damo pitanja konkretno I koncizno I da damo dalje.
Ja sam Nebojša Petković iz Gornjih Nedeljica. Moram da vas vratim na pitanje koje vam je 2 puta postavljeno, niste odgovorili. Ako ne znate, recite, ne znate. Znači, nije problem. I da kažem da su mi već davno rekli ne i da većina ljudi u ovoj sali ovde misli upravo ono što je Ljilja Bralović rekla. A samo vas molim da odgovorite ako znate koliko Nemačka sama proizvodi za sebe tih retkih minerala, koliko eksploatiše tih retkih minerala za svoje potrebe i generalno Evropska unija, ako znate odgovor, naravno.
Sorry. Okay. So you said mined by Germany. Sorry, I thought consumed.
Ne, dobro su preveli zato što ste pitali koliko troši, a ne koliko rudari.
Just a moment. Is there a language issue here? Okay.
So how much Germany is mining? Okay. Not consumption. For their own consumption. Okay. For that question, I can get you.
Just a moment. People, folks.
For that question, I can get you a proper answer from my colleagues at the German NGO Power Shift, 100%. But from my knowledge of Germany, they mostly produce non-metallic minerals for their own consumption. So that's zinc, that's lime, gravel, what have you, and it's usually used for construction sector, right? When it comes to metal mining, when we're talking about lithium, copper, cobalt, it's rare earths. It's not really there at all. But they consume, like I mentioned, they consume the most out of. Actually, Germany is one of the countries that consumes the most critical raw materials in the EU because of their electric vehicles. But they produce extremely little. So sorry for the non-comprehension of that question. But if you want actual numbers, I can absolutely give them to you because there's the German Environmental Agency that has calculated all of these numbers. So if we share emails, I can get that information for you.
Okay, thank you, Diego. We have 2 more questions, and that's all for now. We can do this at the lunchtime. Then I have an announcement. Please, can we have a focus for a minute? We're gonna do, bit ćemo rodnu ravnopravnost, tako da idemo vamo, pa onda napred. Molim vas, pitanja budu koncizna, brza, jasna.
Evo, ja ću brzo. Interesuje me koliko je deo ovog celog diskursa pitanje energy return on energy investment za sve ove rude, zato što način na koji smo mi rudarili pre 100 godina je imao jednu cenu i jednu isplativost i 1% rude, odnosno metala na kraju i svega ostalog što smo dobijali, a sada je to sasvim drugačije i to me interesuje u vezi s ovim što ste spomenuli, što se meni čini da bi trebalo da svi koji se bavimo ovim radikalizujemo kao temu, a to je pitanje prave cene nečega, ovaj true cost koji ste spomenuli, jer mi u Beogradu nekada, u Beogradu, u Srbiji, povremeno kažemo tih, ne znam, 11.000 ljudi koji umre zbog problema sa zagađenim vazduhom i tako dalje. Koja je cena toga? Ili cena svih drugih neljudskih bića koje takođe zbog tog zagađenog vazduha stradaju ili će stradati kroz vreme i kroz godine ako nam se jadar desi. Tako da meni je to pitanje prave cene nečega i prave cene rudarenja jako zanimljivo da bude radikalizovano. Ali me interesuje koliko je ROI, koliko je uopšte prisutan u ovom diskursu.
Hvala. Can we have, da li možemo da i postavimo ovo pitanje? Can we have this question also and then combine it in one answer?
Okay.
Okay. Where is mine? So,
I don't have actually a question, just an information I would like to share. First, shall I speak in Serbian? Na srpskom. Okay. Prelazimo onda na srpski. Radi se naime o tome, imam neke informacije koje bih želeo da podelim, koje se tiču pre 1-2 meseca, recimo, se u Beogradu održavala konferencija o mineralnim sirovinama, o rudarenju, u organizaciji Vlade Srbije i gle čuda ambasade Švedske i Finske, koje si ti upravo pomenuo kao zemlje koje se bave ekstrakcijom i koje su u Laponiji uništile veliki deo površina. Naime, šta sam hteo da kažem? Činjenica je da smo mi nepozvani upali u tu konferenciju, na tu konferenciju savladali obezbeđenje i videli koji su sve igrači u Srbiji zaduženi za razvoj tog, kako oni zovu, održivog rudarenja. Ne znam koliko kome od vas znači ime John Randon, ali je to čovek koga je Rio Tinto angažovao iz obaveštene zajednice i to je čovek koji stoji iza laži o oružjima za masovno uništavanje u Iraku. On je predsjednik takozvane Random grupe i po sopstvenom priznanju je opinion manager, dakle upravljač mišljenjima. Njega je Rio Tinto u Srbiji angažovao kao savjetnika za rad na ovom projektu Jadar. Tako da to treba znati sa kakvim se neprijateljem srećemo, dosta je bitno i mislim da ovo nadilazi samo Srbiju, da je potrebno da se u celoj Evropi koheziono ujedini napor da bismo se nekako izborili s ovim što nas čeka.
Hvala na pitanju. If you remember, ako se sećaš pitanja od Malte, ako možeš da odgovoriš, the true cost.
Yeah, so that's a really difficult question. I don't have a proper answer for that because, like I mentioned earlier, in the environmental impact assessments, they might look into the impacts, but it's not calculated, and it's not at all calculated in like terms of future generations. And this particularly is true in the case of mining waste, which the most concern for me is the mining waste because it's the one that has very little oversight. And at the moment, at least, the EU does have, for example, air pollution directive, air quality directive, sorry. So there are a lot of laws through the Green Deal that these companies are going to have to adhere by. I don't follow the air quality directive, for example, but I don't know how that would be for the mining projects. But I do know that there are situations that can be useful for you to know, and maybe we can work closer together with civil society, how they can tell you what the law is so that you can use it within your own activism. And in terms of the energy return on energy investment, there is a University of Zaragoza, which I shared earlier. They have done their own assessment of energy return on energy investments for particular minerals. And they're finding that in the case of copper, so not necessarily lithium, because lithium right now is one of the materials that hasn't been extracted throughout history. So there is like, it's easier, let's say, than copper, which has very much for 3,000 years. In the case of copper, the energy return on energy investment is really critical, meaning that we're going to spend much more energy to acquire these materials than we are to get them out. However, I should say, there is a little bit of a caveat. Right now, the EU is moving towards, or exploring, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, exploring the recycling of materials from mining waste. And there is a process at the moment going on in which member states are going to have to create a database of where these mining sites are, potentially creating a market to extract these materials. Because at the moment, there is no knowledge, really. Poland has done this. At the moment, they have created a database. It's quite detailed on the mining waste potential of recycling. So this, ideally, what this would do is would reduce the amount of materials needed from primary extraction. But it's still in its infancy, and you know, it ties to the energy return on energy investment because there's a lot of copper just sitting there and a lot of rare earth just sitting there not doing anything, because there's nobody extracting them yet. So yeah, I'm sorry. Let's talk about it more because it's a very detailed question, and I can give you that research if you're interested from the University of Zaragoza.
Imamo jednu repliku ovdje i samo bi napravio obaveštenje i da završimo ovo.
Samo veliko hvala. Veliko hvala Dijegu na ovom odgovoru. Delimično hvala i na ovom pitanju, zato što za neke stvari koje se još ne tiču rudarstva imamo neke podatke od Svetske zdravstvene organizacije i od OECD-a. Navodno, po navodima NGO-a Nacionalna ekološka alijansa, Srbija gubi 1/3 BDP-a zbog zagađenja. Oni kažu zbog zagađenja vazduha. Meni zvuči malo previše, ali treba provjeriti.
Hvala Iskra, hvala svima koji ste izdržali još ovih dodatnih pola sata. sad pravimo pauzu za ručak. Molim da se svi okupimo tačno u 3 kako ne bi imali ponovo ovako jednu zagrejanu debatu. Thank you, Diego, for teaching us a lot of things. Thank you for answering. Hvala, Diego. Molim vas jedan aplauz za Diego. Svi koji...